An exclusive interview with Buzz Aldrin now in a special edition of The Sky at Night, part of our One Giant Leap season here on BBC World News.
All engine running.
I believe that this nation should commit itself
Liftoff on Apollo 11.
to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And returning him safely to the earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Good evening. It's now 40 years since men landed on the moon, one of the greatest achievements in human history. And everyone got very excited about it. Well, earlier, in 1964, I went on a Sky at Night program and talked about it, and I didn't get it quite right.
Well, I've just got back from America, where there's a tremendous interest in what's called Project Apollo. Now, originally, the Americans planned to get a man on the moon by 1970. But, quite honestly, I tend to be a bit wary about this, and I shall be a bit surprised if it happens before 1980 or so, though I may be completely wrong.
Well, I was out by 10 years. Arthur Clarke got it right. I didn't. I'm joined now by doctors Chris Lindott and Chris Lowry. You weren't born, you were just. What do you think about it now, Chris?
Well, I've been annoyed ever since I was a small kid that I wasn't alive to see it. So I'm delighted to have you here who experienced it, and you, Chris, as an expert on Apollo to ask some questions. But looking back, looking at Kennedy's speech promising we were going, I mean, what did we know about going to the moon back in 1961?
Actually, Eisenhower commissioned the Saturn V, so this was all getting going before Kennedy came to power. And in January 61, when there was this change of presidency, actually NASA took their eye off the ball a little bit then because they didn't know what Kennedy wanted to do. And that was when Gagarin went up, then the Bay of Pigs disaster happened, and suddenly Kennedy needed a program. And he went to Lyndon Johnson and said, what should we do? And it was Johnson that suggested going to the moon and taking up NASA on their offer.
What were the big challenges that had to be overcome for Apollo?
The one thing that America was ahead of the Russians on was navigation. And of course, going to the moon is a big navigation problem. You know, as soon as you leave the Earth, the coordinate system that you're used to navigating with is gone, and you've got to invent another one. Which way's up, which way's down. You're heading, of course, for a moving target. You're going to a point in space where the moon's going to be in 3 days' time. So what the Americans had done in the 1950s was come up with this concept called inertial space, where they used gyroscopes and little accelerometers, and they could work out how to navigate a plane, even in the early 50s, from one coast to another without any reference to the ground. Oh. And this was the starting point for going to the moon, and so it was really a navigation issue.
Okay, Apollo 8 is go.
You're riding the best bird we can find.
Apollo 8 seems to mark a change in people's minds, because at that point people started to believe that it was really going to happen. The idea that the Americans could send people down and come back, was that how it felt at the time?
It did, but I think earlier than that it really began with Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite.
And that was only 12 years before Armstrong's step on the moon. I mean, that's the most incredible fact in all of this, that we went from the first artificial satellite to a manned footprint on the moon in 12 years. I mean, I don't think that pace of change will ever happen as fast again.
Something interesting in the bottom of this little crater here.
And in between, of course, we had Apollo 9, which was testing the lunar module in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10, which was sort of a dress rehearsal, right?
Yes, another test of the lunar module, but this time in lunar orbit, and it was the first test of lunar orbit rendezvous and this method of going to land on the moon.
So Apollo 10 had all but landed. I think I would have pressed the button. You would have wanted to have landed.
It must be very tempting.
Although I think their lunar module was too heavy, actually, to get back off, so it would have been a one-way ticket. And so it just left 11 to complete that last 50,000 feet down to the surface. And I say just, but, you know, it's very hard to go from flying at about 4,000, 3,500, 4,000 miles an hour in lunar orbit to standing still on the surface of the moon in about 12 minutes. That's how long that descent takes.
I know.
So with Apollo 11, what were the unknowns?
What worried me was the actual touchdown.
Contact right.
Come at an angle, then you can't get back. And that, to me, was always the worry. And the second worry I had was when they blasted away, because they had one ascent engine that had to work properly first time.
Port stage, engine arm ascent, proceed.
Lift off.
And you have to remember with that ascent engine as well that they were untested. I mean, they tested them in development, but you couldn't physically test fire these things on the ground because the fuel was so corrosive it would destroy the engine in a few more weeks. So they were only fired up for the first time after that countdown on the moon to bring them back safely.
Proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good.
And the whole point about Apollo, there was no provision for rescue.
In those days, the risk was just part of the job, and 50-50 was about the odds, I think, for at least 8 and 11, probably the others as well. I mean, you've got to remember, they got more ambitious as these missions went on.
They did.
And so we get very quickly into the science missions with, after 13 and the near accident there. But those last 3 missions, the so-called J-class science missions, they all went to very mountainous areas.
They did.
And with 17, they landed in a box canyon, a deep, deep canyon in that last mission. Spectacular scenery. Of course, they all 3 carried the lunar rover, this ingenious roving vehicle that folded up, made by Boeing and General Motors. And that allowed them to travel an extra 56 miles around the landing sites.
I know.
There's still a big legacy of Apollo, though, that is something that we should just dwell on a little bit in this 40th anniversary year, which was the ecological awareness that Apollo produced.
Oh, yes.
First of all, from Apollo 8 and that wonderful Earthrise picture that came back on Christmas '68. And then later, right the way through to Apollo 17 with that fantastic view of Antarctica and Africa there, which is, I'm told, the most reproduced photograph in human history. And these all had an effect on the sort of collective psyche, if you like.
Chris, thank you very much. Just remember, though, it all depended upon the Saturn V rocket, a huge thing, and designing and building that was quite a job.
The launch of an Apollo mission wasn't only an event for those watching on the beach in Florida, but was followed avidly all around the world. Amongst those clustered in front of televisions was a young John Davis. Now an astronomer at the Advanced Technology Centre in Edinburgh, like all who saw them, the Apollo missions captured his imagination. Well, this is exactly how I imagine it would have been back at the launch of Apollo 11 on July the 16th, 1969. We've got the Saturn V on what passes for a launch pad.
This is the most powerful rocket in the world. It's 363 feet high and it weighs about 2,500 tons. And it's all to get this bit to the moon and this bit back again.
And of course we've got the astronauts in there waiting for liftoff. When do things really get started?
The system switches to internal computer control at T-30, but nothing happens until the engines start, and that's at T-7. And only when the engines are all running happily do they give the command launch commit. T3, 2, 1, 0. Launch commit, and then we're on our way to the moon. Well, the first stage here burns for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and then once it's out of fuel, it's just dead weight, so it's time to get rid of it.
OK, well, let's go for that then.
Explosive bolts fire here.
This will drop down into the ocean.
Right, the second stage engines fire, and a few moments after that, this little interstage ring falls away. These 5 J2 engines generate about 1 million pounds of thrust between them, and they push the third stage almost into Earth orbit. Now the spacecraft's high enough that we don't need this escape tower, so it's time for that to go. And for the first time, the astronauts can see where they're going.
Neil Armstrong confirming both the engine skirt separation and the launch escape tower separation.
Well, the second stage burns for another 7 minutes or so, but even that's not enough to get this whole thing into space. The second stage engines run out, and then we separate the third stage about here, and the last single J2 engine burns for another couple of minutes to put them into orbit around the Earth. The last 11.5 minutes have been very busy, but now there's a bit of time, about 2 hours, as the spacecraft goes around the Earth, and it's time to check it out, make sure they're ready to make the next big decision, which is, are we going to the moon or are we coming home?